Afternoon, everyone, and there are a couple of familiar faces in the audience. It's great to be here and absolutely thrilled with the support from Macedon Rangers Council on this piece of work, which is incredibly important. I might just start by giving you a bit of an overview, very quick overview of Wildlife Victoria, so you properly understand what it is we do. I think you'll be surprised that we do a lot more than just answer the phone for wildlife in distress. So, Alicia, over the page. We're not a government organisation, albeit a lot of the public seem to think we are. We're actually a charity. We're a not-for-profit organisation that started in 1989 with a couple of people with a desk, the old probably dial phone back then, in their lounge room, realising that wildlife needed help, and has grown to the organisation we are today. So statewide, we are operating 24/7, so there's a staff member from Wildlife Victoria on the phone at 2 a.m, Christmas Day, 6 a.m, lunchtime, it doesn't matter. We are there. We have a real human based here in the state of Victoria who's a trained emergency response operator taking calls from the public. Last year we took over 130,000 calls from help right across the state for sick, injured and orphaned wildlife. And what I tell people, you know, Tanya alluded to me previously having a corporate career. This spring we had a 52% increase in case volume. Now, if I was running a business and had a 52% increase in sales, I couldn't be happier. But for us as a charity, that means an increase in operating costs, and it means that our wildlife are getting increasingly impacted and need our help. And I'll talk a bit more about road trauma. We get about 7% of our total operating costs from government, from the state government, and we're reliant on donations to run our services. Our services are provided completely free of charge, so there's no cost, and we have our head office in Abbotsford, and we've also launched a couple of years ago a travelling vet service that's 7 days a week, that is a wildlife vet and vet nurse that are doing patient management for wildlife in care with wildlife shelters, plus respond in field to wildlife emergencies. And our vet team are often in Macedon Ranges, visiting a couple of your large wildlife shelters here, attending to local animals. And we've got a hub at Nunawading servicing the outer Melbourne and right up to here, and also a hub in West Gippsland that unfortunately is often in East Gippsland as well. We desperately need more of these services across the state, and it's the only service of its kind in Australia. So well done, Victoria. We've got something quite unique here. And we've got a statewide network of volunteers. Next page, please, Alicia. I'll give a very quick run through of what we do. So we've got our hotline that you'll be familiar with probably, which is our 24/7 emergency response service. Our emergency response operators, we call them EROs. The typical profile there is someone with a degree in wildlife conservation, ecology, zoology, with customer service experience. Pretty much all of our staff are also volunteers. So it's not uncommon, like yesterday where we had an extreme heat day, mid-morning, even though I'm the CEO, I was in field attending to a heat-stressed electrocuted flying fox, and all of our staff were all over the place dealing with heat stress. So we're pretty active as volunteers too. We have the vet team, as I mentioned. I won't elaborate there because I've mentioned that. Our volunteers. So we have 11 office staff, and that's it. And the rest of the team are in operations. So they're on the phone or they're vets. And we have only 3 staff looking after 1,500 volunteers across the state. So we have a volunteer help desk. We have an EAP service, which is free mental health and wellbeing support 24/7. You know, we have training, both initial basic rescue and transport training and upskill training, so on macropods and, you know, flying foxes and seabirds and things like that, and also provide our volunteers where we can with financial grants. So each year we've provided, since in the last 3 or 4 years, $2.4 million to our volunteers in money to help them with formula for wildlife in care, for fuel and things like that. No budget this year, unfortunately, for a big grants program, but nevertheless throughout spring we've provided financial assistance to a lot of wildlife shelters that have taken a lot of orphaned animals in. Again, 52% increase in wildlife incidents this spring, and also fuel cards for people that are quite active. And at the moment we've got fires in the west of the state, and we're in touch with our volunteers there to see what help and support they need. So it's a pretty busy space. Community, things like this. So it's people like you that are in your communities that care about wildlife that we are very passionate and keen on engaging with. And advocacy, so we do a huge amount of work with government. I meet regularly with the State Environment Minister, with various government agencies and departments, because Wildlife Victoria is sitting on years of wildlife data right across the state. So we can tell you exactly to the pin drop where the hotspot areas are. We've got information on habitat loss, on all sorts of things that we feed into government policy and advocate for better protection for our wildlife. And an example of that is the Wildlife Act that protects wildlife was written in 1975. And there's a review of the Wildlife Act, and I lost several hours of my life poring over, I think, a 400-page document we ended up submitting, but we had all the data, so that's important. And then we engage at the operational level and strategic level with others in the sector, like Zoos Victoria, Parks Victoria, DECA, etc. Next page, Alicia. I hope I'm preaching to the converted here, but why do we care about wildlife road trauma, and why do we care about our wildlife? And I'll draw your attention to that picture on the left. Planet Earth depends on wildlife. So every single native animal that is Indigenous to Australia has a unique role in our ecosystem, and an important one. And that includes things like soil health, propagation of grasses, flowering health of our eucalypt forests with flying foxes, for example. So every animal's unique. If we lose those animals, we are going to impact our ecosystem. And if we impact our ecosystem, it is going to impact us humans in terms of our quality of life, the soil health, the health of our rivers, etc. And we know a lot of people that live on the land are frontline on some of these ecosystem impacts. Our wildlife are not only important, but in facing really significant threat from us humans. The top three is habitat destruction. We've got bushfires right across the state. We're also clearing bush. We've got urbanisation. Big one. One of the biggest things we have to deal with at Wildlife Victoria is growth in human population and land being cleared for housing, and the poor animals that live there don't understand that's not their home anymore, and we're left dealing with macropods hit by cars and things on new estates. It's pretty awful. And climate change. Big one. If I map out the last 10 years of our case data, which I have, and look at what's happened. Years ago, summer was our bad time. We used to worry about bushfires and heat, but the climate is becoming not just hotter, but increasingly variable and increasing severity. Our biggest day in Wildlife Victoria's history was actually last October. Why? We had heavy storms and high winds. The October before was equally an absolute nightmare. Why? Heavy storms, high winds. So that time of year our wildlife have young. They've got pouch young, there's birds nesting in trees, our wildlife are most vulnerable, and it was a nightmare. So we've had to shift our focus and attention and get ready a lot earlier in the year for wildlife emergencies now. And also, and this was alluded to up front, it impacts us volunteers having to deal with this. And bottom line, our wildlife don't have a voice. And it's up to us to help them. Thanks, Alicia. All right, let's have a little look at Macedon Ranges. Not great news for Macedon Ranges in terms of wildlife incidents. So the total number of wildlife rescues attended to by Wildlife Victoria in the last 5 years here in Macedon Ranges exceeds by far anywhere else in the state of Victoria. Anywhere else. The entire Shire is nearly 5% of the total statewide rescue volume and is 200% higher than the closest high volume area, which, just for everyone's information, is around Eildon Way. So this is pretty serious. The primary rescue cause type is wildlife hit by vehicles, and over the last 5 years, 30% of the total cases in this area was wildlife road trauma. 4,160 animals were hit by cars in Macedon Ranges Shire in the past 5 years. These are only the ones reported to Wildlife Victoria, and I'll touch on that in a minute. That's on average close to 3 animals a day. That's a lot. Thanks, Alicia. The top 5 species impacted there: number 1, eastern grey kangaroos; 2nd, swamp wallabies; 3rd, ringtail possums; 4 wombats, and 5 magpies. And I'm sure that'll be no surprise to a lot of you in the room. Thanks, Alicia. I want to spend a bit of time talking about kangaroos and talk to you about a case study. So kangaroos represent 61% of the total wildlife road incidents here in Macedon Ranges. And we responded to just hit by vehicle only 2,552 kangaroos in the last 5 years. Were they all reported in to Wildlife Victoria for help? Is the number higher than that? I'm going to tell you yes to both of those things. In Easter last year, we'd been spending a lot of time engaging with Phillip Island Nature Park and the community there, who, like you, were deeply concerned about wildlife road trauma. And Easter's the busiest time of year there. Like here, you get a lot of visitors coming through. And I said, right, let's do this. I'm going myself to live on Phillip Island for 7 days, spanning Easter, with some of my vets, with some vet nurses and some of the operations team, and we are going to do the following. For 7 days, we got up before dawn, and it's a small space, so it was easy to do. We split up and did dawn patrols all around the island. We noted every animal we saw. We did it again at dusk. We did it again late at night. We didn't get much sleep. And we did that repeatedly for 7 days. And we were the only people responding to wildlife. So the nature park stood down, the community, our local volunteers stood down. I said, look, send everything through so we've got one team and we're collecting data. Guess what? Out of those 7 days, I can barely see those numbers, Alicia. 83% of the animals we responded to that were road trauma were not called in for help. So our vets were conducting roadside euthanasia of joeys in pouches and adult animals, and we obviously were dealing with a number of deceased and disturbingly some threatened species there as well. So if that's just a microcosm of the state of Victoria, I think just take the numbers that we're giving you as probably the tip of the iceberg. All right, so that doesn't sound good, but there's a lot we can do about this. And there are a range of solutions, and I assume we'll get into a bit more conversation about this later, but speed limit reductions have a very, very tangible impact on road trauma for wildlife. And there's been a number of studies conducted in various states about that. Variable message signage, and I'll show you an example of that over the page. Community engagement, things like this, as simple as know the Wildlife Victoria phone number so you can get help. It doesn't matter what time it is, call it in. So letting people know, making sure people are lobbying, council or state government, watching what's going on in your local area, being quite engaged in advocating for your wildlife. There's a whole range of solutions around wildlife movement. So that's keeping them away from roads, and they include things like fauna exclusion fencing, virtual fencing, underpasses and overpasses, refuge poles, rope bridges. Animals do use them. So where some of these have been implemented and studies have been done, animals are using them. And here's a couple of examples. So on the left are some good examples of variable messaging signage, but there's something wrong with that signage, which I've indicated there. But the right-hand side's a good one. What studies have shown is where you've got fixed signage, and it's everywhere across the state, a picture of a diamond of a kangaroo with Wildlife Victoria number. People just get used to seeing it. It's sort of back of mind, but at certain times of year, we know wildlife are going to be on the move. Even echidnas are on the move at a certain time of year. So this sort of signage, where it's variable, it depends on a range of things. It could be time of day, at dusk or dawn. It could be during spring when there's a lot of young. It could be anything, but this really grabs the driver's attention. What's missing? There's no call to action on either of those signs. So the signs are great, but if there is a collision with wildlife, you still need to know who to call. And on the right-hand side is an example of a virtual fencing pole. And what they are is they're poles, and it's not fencing per se, but they emit light and sound to effectively discourage wildlife from going onto the road. And again, it's very early technology, and there's still research being undertaken, and there's variable results, but that's another example. And look, I will say too, none of these things in isolation are going to work. It's really what is the package of solutions or mix of solutions that are going to work for a particular area. Roles for government, habitat protection. Habitat protection. The biggest thing people ask me, and every time I'm doing media, no matter where in the state, well, what can we do? Everybody plant native things in your garden. It's food for our wildlife. Even people living in units or with balconies, put small native shrubs on your balcony. Trust me, you revegetate the land and put food trees and habitat trees and shrubs for wildlife, the wildlife will come. Ecotourism is a really, really big thing. So areas where local governments can get involved is really promoting ecotourism and attracting people to the area that are quite interested in wildlife. Major event planning, and there was a bit of media about a major event, I think on the Mornington Peninsula a little while ago, that was going to take place in a nature reserve with a lot of flashing lights and things like that. So when planning major events, just be conscious of what wildlife might already live there, what impact that event's going to have on them, and maybe choose a location that'll be less impactful on the local flora and fauna. And training, so we have in the audience here a couple of local wildlife volunteers. Wildlife rescue volunteers are members of your community. They are you, and we need more of them, as I'm sure those here today will attest. It's not easy work. and it's tough. But by sharing the load and training up more members of the community in becoming wildlife rescue volunteers will make an enormous difference. Please, please, please consider doing that. That would make a big difference. And, you know, this sign on the right is habitat protection. Developments are a big problem for us, as I mentioned earlier, and wildlife needs to be considered in development planning, especially where housing, roads and construction will destroy wildlife habitat. So I didn't want to over-talk. I hope I've stuck to time, but that's it. Put that number in your phone, everyone. If that's one thing you can do today, please do that. But thanks for your time and look forward to chatting further throughout the day.